So you're at Jimby Live. We are delighted to have you here. This is monthly webinar series to learn about the recently published education research in Jimby. And it also allows the authors the opportunity to share their research with you. So today we're very excited to talk about collaborative two-stage exams benefit students in a biology laboratory course. So with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jimby Live and Rachel, for inviting me to share a little bit of our work. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. So you should be able to see our first slide. I'm really thrilled to be presenting this work on behalf of myself. My name is Dr. Claire Meaders. I'm in the School of Biological Sciences here at UC San Diego. And I want to start off by acknowledging my recently graduated master's student, Yelila Vega, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, but was an incredible contributor to this project. And so even though we're in a webinar, I do want to build in a little bit of active learning here. And so I'm really curious about, if you are an educator, what type of courses you teach, especially if they're a lecture or lab. And so if you can go to menti.com and use the code 9334-4291, should be able to hopefully enter hopefully this will work. You should be able to click the Menti link or use your cell phone browser and submit responses. So that way we can all kind of see who is here. Great. Cures, microbiology, lecture and lab, intrabiology, lecture and labs, fantastic. I also teach both lecture and lab courses. Multiple microbiology lectures and lab, that's fantastic. Wonderful. So this really gives me a sense of who's here, anatomy and physiology, lecture and lab. Wonderful. Yeah. So this is hopefully going to be directly relevant. The course in which I was the focus of our research study was a upper level biology lecture and lab course. And I'll share a little bit about that shortly. Wonderful. Micro. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. So I'm going to X out of this. Oh, nope, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry about that. Oh my gosh, always a little bit of troubleshooting. All right, so let's go into slides. So hopefully you should be able to, are you seeing a slide that says my background?
Yes, we are.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So I want to start off just introducing myself, since you all were kind enough to take the time to share a little bit about the types of courses that you all teach. My background is in bench. So I started off in bench science when I was a graduate student. I was in an organismic and evolutionary biology department studying plants, specifically the Aquilegia flower over here. And it was during that time as a graduate student that I was doing a lot of TAing. I started getting more interested in pedagogy and getting involved with our Center for Teaching and Learning. And that really was kind of an existential moment for me, where I realized I learned about this field where you could do research with a focus of improving how we teach and how students learn and exploring student sense of belonging in the classroom. And so for my postdoc, I switched into biology education research. And this is me presenting some of my first work about how students experience large introductory STEM courses. And so that was the focus of my postdoc. And that brought me to UCSD, where I started as an assistant teaching professor in November of 2020, which was peak pandemic. And so I just want to share a little bit of context for kind of how this study was born about. Was really me trying to think about best teaching practices that I could employ in online settings, and doing a lot of reading, doing a lot of studying of what was out there that other folks had done. And then I found, once we transitioned back from online to in-person, and here's me with our first, some of my TAs, our first time coming back into the classroom, and our lab staff, what methods we could take from online that would translate to in person as well. And again, I just want to shout out Yuli La Vega, my fantastic recently graduated student who helped with a lot of the qualitative work of this study. And so I know many of you mentioned that you teach lecture and lab. I teach both. So I've kept up with, I was able to apply what I learned from my postdoc for large introductory classes. I teach our intro biology class here at UCSD. And then I also teach our small, about 50 student upper level lab course. And that's going to be the focus of today. And so a little bit more context. Oh gosh, some of the slides are cut off, but the text at the bottom is a little bit cut off, but I'll walk us through that. So the course context is this is an upper level biology lab. Here at UCSD, we're on the quarter system. And so it's about 10 weeks of instruction. In week 1, I usually do a first week survey to get to know students. A couple of these questions are about students' prior knowledge and their background. The only prerequisite for our upper level recombinant DNA techniques class is our first class in the intro series, the cell. And so students are all coming in with at least that prerequisite or AP biology, which fulfills that. But there's a lot of variation in what other courses they've taken. And so one of the questions that I ask is who has taken molecular biology so that I can be intentional about when we're forming groups, making sure that there's different backgrounds are spread apart so that students aren't isolated in terms of their level of experience that they're coming in with. I do 3 exams in this course. And so in week 4, we have exam 1. In week 7, we have exam 2. And then for this study, we gave a survey after the exam about student experiences with 2-stage exams. And then in week 10, we have our final, our last exam of the course. And I do want to mention that our exams are weighted differently. I don't think I included this detail in the paper, but I consistently weight exams where the highest exam is worth a certain portion of their course grade, typically around 18%. The middle exam is worth about 12%, and the lowest exam is worth 0. And so students can drop their lowest, and if they have an off day, it's not going to completely crush their experience in the course. And if they have an on day, that's something where it is rewarded. And I do want to share a little bit about our course learning goals, because I think this kind of helps put into context why I chose to use 2-stage exams for this course. So it's a upper level recombinant DNA techniques course. And in this course, it consists of both lecture and lab. And so our goals include applying knowledge of molecular biology concepts, really thinking about experimental design, collecting, analyzing data, drawing conclusions, reviewing primary literature, doing their own scientific writing. So they have a final lab report at the end of the quarter. And this last one is the one that I want to focus on the most here, collaborating with each other to learn biological concepts and laboratory skills. In this class, we really emphasize working together in groups, especially during the pandemic. We were spending our 2 4-hour labs really in breakout groups where the TAs and myself, we would bounce between different breakout groups, and students were in the same groups throughout the whole quarter where they worked on experimental design and problem solving. And we've maintained that as we've moved back into the classroom where they work in pairs with a lab partner on their quarter-long experiments. But one thing that I noticed during the pandemic was in thinking about our course learning goals, how were we assessing them? And so we had students working on lab notebooks and a final lab report. We had weekly quizzes that students could take multiple times until they reached mastery of the material. I did in-class formative assessments, and I mentioned the summative assessments exams. But exams we know are, even if we weight them differently, they are high stakes, which can be stressful for students. There's delayed feedback and teamwork and collaboration, which is something that I highly value and we embed in the practices in our classroom, was missing from our assessments. And this felt to me like a giant disconnect between what we were trying to embed within the course. And I often talk to students about how the way that we structure our grading should match what we are emphasizing in the course. And this seemed like a glaring disconnect to me. And so and also just to highlight that teamwork in general is a valued 21st century skill. These screenshots are from the AAAS Vision and Change report, where collaboration is a core competency. And then the National Research Council report also emphasizing the importance of collaboration. So not only is it something that I personally want to embed in courses, but it is a recommended skill and competency that students are developing in the classroom. And so our solution was to implement two-stage collaborative exams. And these collaborative exams consist of an individual exam that students will take on their own, and then they submit their individual exam, and then they get a subset of the most challenging open-ended questions and they get to take it as a group together, so a collaborative exam. And I do want to highlight that this is not something that I came up with. Collaborative two-stage exams have been around for a long time, but it was something where we decided to implement them in this context of an upper-level biology course, both during online teaching and then in person. And since there are a lot of educators in this space, I'm curious if you yourselves have participated in a two-stage exam as a student or an educator. And so I think you should be able to vote on this question now. All right, so a lot of folks here are new to two-stage exams, and that's awesome. Yeah, there's no right or wrong answer here. I love that you all are here, and I'm happy to, especially during the Q&A portion, answer questions about my experience doing two-stage exams. I'm a full-on convert. I still do that. Like, I did them for this study, and I've continued to implement them as well. So thank you so much. And there are a few folks here who have implemented two-stage exams. And during the Q&A, if you want to share your tips and best practices, I definitely welcome learning about those as well. So thank you so much, everyone. Right, so let's go back to our Google Slides. And I apologize, this is my first time using Mentimeter embedded in, or with Google Slides embedded in. So we've got to kind of flip back through slides. Okay, two-stage exams. And I want to highlight that a lot of research has been done on this type of structure of individual and group exams. And research has found that they benefit student learning across multiple disciplines. This is just a subset. I chose a couple of studies if you're interested just in learning more. They've been shown repeatedly in physics courses, recently in chemistry, sociology, geoscience, earth and ocean science. Again, this is just a subset of studies that have explored the benefits of this structure. And in general, two-stage exams result in increases in higher scores, so strictly measured in terms of performance. Oh, yes, thank you, Stanley. Other more recent research has shown that open-ended questions can improve student retention of course content. And then in general, also increase performance for all students, but in particular for lower performing students. And so in this particular study, we set out to explore how student performance on the individual and group components of two-stage exams compared in our upper level biology lab course that was offered online and in person. So we collected data from two separate terms. We also set out to explore if two-stage exams were a strategy that could be used to address grade equity gaps, in particular for peer students or persons who have been excluded based on ethnicity or race from STEM. And lastly, we set out to explore how biology students perceived two-stage exams in terms of impacting their learning. And so just to set the stage for context, this was in winter that we collected data in winter of 2022 and spring of 2022. And if you remember, winter 2022 was the height of Omicron. So at UCSD, we went online for the first 4 weeks of our quarter, and then we switched back to in-person. So students had about half of their term online and half of their term in person. And then spring, we were fully in person. For consistency, during winter quarter, all exams were held online because at that point, students had their first exam online, and I didn't think it would be fair to introduce even if it was the same structure, switch from online to in-person. And so they worked collaboratively in breakout group rooms for their group portion of the exam winter quarter. For participation, we had about 85% of students consent to participate in this research study from winter 2022 and 80% from spring 2022. And we had access to institutional data for a couple of different demographics. So whether or not students identified as persons excluded by ethnicity or race, based on UCSD definitions, all that the data that I got was the de-identified data, whether UCSD had identified students as the UCSD definition of underrepresented minority. And then we also had gender, women represented about half of our population in winter 22 and the majority of our population in spring of 2022. And so for our exam structure, I mentioned that the timing was 3 exams throughout the term. Our individual exam students had about 60 minutes and the group exam was about 30. I'll mention later on that I ended up playing around with the timing of the group exam just to give folks a little bit more time to discuss after receiving student feedback. And the groups that students were in were their lab groups, which were consistent throughout the whole quarter. This ended up being about 4 or 5 students. When we were online, this was all the students who had been in a breakout room. When we were in person, it would be 2 separate groups of lab pairs that worked together. So typically all the students within a lab bay. And we followed recommended best practices from Carl Wyman's work, where the group exam could only help, not hurt student grades. And so what we mean by that is that if a student, the percent that they had received on their individual exam was higher than their cumulative individual plus group exam, then we kept their individual percent as their exam grade. Our data collection included exam scores, student survey data that we collected in week 7. So this was Likert type attitude questions. So students answered on a scale from 1 to 4 how they felt about or their agreement about certain items. We asked about their strategies that they used, and we asked an open-ended question for them to share their perceptions of strategies. And I want to start off just sharing that our data is consistent with a lot of work that's been done in other studies as well, where students performed highest on the group portion of the exam. So here we're looking at 3 different exams from both winter quarter and spring quarter. Every circle represents the exam score for one student. The blue represents the individual exam and pink represents the group. And for all of the exams, we had significantly higher results from the group exam compared to the individual exam. And I do want to mention again that students would submit their individual, then they would get together in groups without having seen a key, and they would rediscuss questions. One question that we also asked was just how often did students benefit from the group exam? So especially here, we can see that there was overall, on average, students were benefiting, but there was quite a bit of variation. And so, for example, a student who did really well on the individual may not receive the same amount of benefit from the group. Overall, out of our sample, 47 students were helped on all of the exams that they took. 24 students were helped on 2 exams, 8 students on 1, and there were only 2 students where out of both quarters where the group exam did not help them on their exams. We also noticed, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, these are cut off, that there this should have been there were unfortunately equity gaps on the individual portion of exams. So what I'm highlighting here is the means, the average on the individual exam, group exam, or individual exam for 1, 2, and 3. And I'm highlighting that there were differences where students who were identified as not being persons typically excluded by ethnicity or race consistently received significantly higher grades on the individual portion of the exam compared to their peers. So this should have been, there were, unfortunately. I would love if there had not been equity gaps. This is something as an educator, I know we are all striving for. And so this was part of my motivation to kind of identify what strategies can we use to address this in the classroom. So p-values here represent that these were significant. There were, interestingly, no significant differences on exam 3. All right, but there were no equity gaps on the group portion of exams, which was wonderful for me to see. So here we're looking at group scores for all these students, and we can see the average group scores had increased for everyone, and these exams, we did not identify significant differences. And so collectively, equity gaps slightly decreased for student final exam grades. And so despite there being equity gaps on the individual exams, and that's something that I am actively working on to address with my teaching methods, because that's something we never want to see as an educator, it was wonderful to me to see that the group exam, there were no significant differences. And so because of that, this really helped students who had experienced those equity gaps on the individual exam. Okay, so now let's think about how students approached the group portion of the exams. And for this, I do have a Menti question for us, because I'd like for you to predict. Students could be approaching the group portion in any number of different ways. Let's rank the approach that you think students most commonly took. Did they discuss each question until all members agreed on an answer and explanation? Did they take a vote, and if unanimous, move on? Otherwise, discuss the questions until all members agreed on an answer? Would they take a vote and use the majority to determine an answer? Or would they use the answers from the one person in the group who knew the most biology? What do you think was the most common? Great, thank you. And I'll leave this open for about 20 seconds to get more votes in. Looks like our most common so far prediction is that students used the answers from the one person in the group who knew the most biology. Yeah, and these are all different strategies that could be used within a group. I think that especially when we think about students having a limited amount of time to approach, they may try to be strategic in how they are approaching. Great. Okay, so it looks like our number one is still using the answers from the one person who knew the most. Our second most common answer is discussing each question until all members agreed on an answer and explanation. Right, so let's see what students actually did. I think the best way is to go back to slides. There we go. And I've got to skip through again. I apologize for this. Where are we? We are here. Okay, so let's do the big reveal. So students actually discussed each question until all members agreed on an answer and explanation. That was the most common approach, which as an educator myself, it made me really happy to see that students were taking the time to fully engage in consensus building. And that was something that we tried to emphasize. Myself and the instructional assistants, we really throughout the term emphasized that learning would happen as they were discussing, and that it was really important that every member of the group agree when they submitted their responses. And that was actually something that they had to sign on the first page of the exam, an agreement that they had reached consensus. And so about 84% of the students took that approach. The other approaches were used by students in the course. So some students did take a vote, and if unanimous, move on. Otherwise, they would discuss the questions until they reached consensus. And so that was a version of A, but a little bit more strategic in terms of time. Some students took a vote and used the majority to determine the answer. And then one group reported using the answers from the one person in the group who knew the most biology. And now let's think about how students perceived group work in the two-stage exam. So we've learned a little bit about how the group exams were helpful for students, and students seem to be using consensus building approaches. But how did they perceive these experiences? So we used Likert type questions on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we asked students to rank their levels of agreement. Overall, oh gosh, I'm so sorry that everything's getting cut off. Well, you'll have to see the paper for the full figure, but overall, students were reporting that they understood the material more clearly when they had a group from the group exams. They reported enjoying them. They disagreed with the statement that students in my group unfairly benefited, which was good. We wanted them to disagree with that statement. And this was fairly consistent across quarters. So both in winter and spring quarter, students overall perceived these exams as helpful and enjoyable. We were able to take student responses. So since we had student responses to all these individual items, we were able to collapse them down into one summary score for students. And we looked at student perceptions of two-stage exams and their attitudes towards group work. And so this basically just meant taking an average of their items. And overall, students reported around a 3.4 mean. And so what that means is they were somewhere between agree and strongly agree that they felt positively about two-stage exams. So overall, positive feelings. We were also able to take the summary score and identify, are there differences in perceptions for students across demographic groups? And so we have our mean scores, we had demographic variables. We were able to look for attitudes towards two-stage exams and attitudes towards group exams. Are there significant differences in these mean scores? And thankfully, we did not identify significant differences. And so a takeaway from this is that regardless of demographic background, for gender or for peer student status, students were perceiving the exams as helpful and positive. And that's exactly what we wanted, where we wanted students to all be having a positive experience. We then also asked students to share more of their experiences with the exams. And so we asked students this open-ended question: how did you perceive the exams? And out of 81 students, 73 chose to respond to this question. And I'd like for you just to take a moment to yourself and predict, what do you think were the most common positive experiences? Like what contributed to a student positive experience and what might have contributed to a student negative experience? And I think I do have time. I know I'm running a little over, but I would love to hear thoughts. And so I'm going to start this question. This will be our last question, and then we'll see what students reported. So what aspects do we think would have contributed to positive or negative experiences? Yeah, the aha moments, absolutely. So being able to actually reflect on a question. Any other thoughts? What might contribute to a negative experience? Yep, feeling bad for not knowing the answer when peers do. Positive, fun, and sense of community. Thank you so much for improvement. So definitely improvement in grades, voices listen to, teamwork. If students felt like others didn't contribute, or pressure, that could contribute to negative experiences as well. Thank you. I'm going to go back to our slides. Oops, sorry. And let's see what students reported. And so we were able to take all of the student open-ended questions. Just want to make sure I don't go too far. Okay. So students reported a variety of factors that contributed to their overall positive experiences. The most common that we coded, so 49 students reported that the structure was useful for them. They often made statements similar to what I saw in the Menti, that they were able to learn from their mistakes right away, make those aha moments, or even we identified some metacognitive statements, so identifying areas to work on. They were able to see how others approached problems, and then they were able to better understand concepts. A few students mentioned that it was better for their grade, reduced stress, so relieved that test anxiety of their whole exam grade coming from one individual portion. I saw that someone had reported fun. Some students mentioned that increasing sense of belonging or group camaraderie as well. And then a number of them just used these positive statements of liking or loving or appreciating as well. There were, so a couple of example quotations from students. One student mentioned that they enjoyed the two-stage exams since they had been working with their group since the beginning of the year, and they were able to trust their knowledge and opinions when going over questions. And another student reported that they really helped. During the two-group portion, they got insight in how other students answered the questions themselves. This helped them see how they approached and answered the questions, and they could reflect on what they did wrong, which helped them learn better. Now, there were some students who reported negative experiences as well. So we coded a number, 10 total statements across students. And these were what some of you predicted. So increased stress, feeling rushed for time, exam fatigue after multiple exams, or comparing themselves to others, or thinking a few statements were made about just exam logistics. When we were back in person, they wanted some more copies of the exam just because we were in groups, but trying to kind of everyone was masked, staying distant, but we were trying to kind of coordinate those logistics of how to actually work on a group exam collectively and discuss when not everyone could read the questions. And so there were some things that we had to troubleshoot. And some of the negative statements were, I just found these mentally exhausting. By the second stage, I was not thinking as clearly because I'd worked so hard on the first part. And then another student shared that they felt that the group portion of the exam was stressful, socially taxing, and they were more likely to relent to the more dominant voice than fight for their own opinion and waste time. And so the student stated that they felt that the group work should be given more time because of the aspect of discussion that occurs in a group that does not occur when they were taking exams by themselves. And so this student statement helped me revise, and I started adding a little bit more time to group exams so that students could really engage in discussion and not feel rushed. I do want to highlight that only 4 of the 73 students reported only negative perceptions. There were some students who reported mixed perceptions. And so a student who reported both positive and negative perceptions shared that it sometimes made them feel incompetent if other group members knew how to tackle a problem, but it was useful in understanding how to approach problems. And then another student shared that they liked getting new perspectives from group members, but this also gave them a little bit of extra test anxiety when they realized that they did a problem correctly, their group did, and I probably got it wrong. And so some mixed perceptions, acknowledgement of the utility, but also acknowledgement of the stress that can cause for students. And so we lastly asked, were some students more likely than others to perceive two-stage exams differently with their open-ended responses? Thankfully, we found no significant differences in student perceptions across gender, peer student status, or by group exam gains. And so by that, I mean, if a student benefited on all the exams by having a group exam, were they more likely to perceive group exams positively than students who had not benefited? We did not find significant differences there. But we did identify significant differences based on term, where a few more students in spring quarter when we were in person reported these mixed perceptions of the two-stage exams. And I think a lot of that was due to the logistics of us figuring out how to best do these in person while we also had lab work to do as well. And we did find differences based on group exam approach. So students who, there were only a few students who reported negative perceptions. They were spread out across different approaches. But overall, most students who reported discussing each question until all members agreed on an answer and explanation reported positive perceptions. And so while this is, thankfully, we only had a few students who reported negative approaches, this does say to me that it's likely that if groups are really engaging in that collaboration, they're more likely to have a positive experience. So in conclusion, we found that student performance was comparable across terms. These two-stage exams really helped all students, and students overall perceived the exams positively. And I learned a lot. I think that two-stage exams, they worked really well in a biology course, both online and in person. Online, it was great because I was able to let students know that they would be able to work in their groups. And so that really helped establish group camaraderie in a time when, especially when we were only online at the beat for the first 4 weeks of the quarter, we were all facing challenges of how do you establish that sense of belonging in the classroom. And so I think that was really helpful for students. We found that promoting consensus building approaches really helped groups feel positively. And so I really encourage all educators to just, if you're engaging with two-stage exams, consistently remind students about the importance of discussing and everyone being able to engage. And then my own experience adjusting for time can help alleviate stress. And so with that, I know I've run a little bit long, so I will wrap up here and take any questions.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was really nice and interesting. I have a bunch of questions, but we have questions from the audience too. And I'd like to start with one that I had this question as well. So the question is, when you assign students in groups, do you keep them in the same group for the entire course, or did you alter the groups? And from your paper, you said that these were pre-existing groups that worked together in a lab. So the crux of this question is, do you have any idea whether that cohesion that they built from working together for the entire semester really helped promote their ability to work effectively as a group?
I do. I absolutely do. And I think part of this is, and I didn't mention this today or in the paper, but during week 1 of the quarter, we have an initial very low stakes assignment where students, because they're coming in with such varied molecular biology backgrounds, some students have taken molecular bio, some students have not, and we built groups not just based on molecular bio experiences, but based on a variety of different factors. We wanted to make sure that everyone was on the same page moving forward. So we cover a couple of concepts early in the course. We have a low stakes, similar to a two-stage exam structure, but not an exam. In lab, the students, before their second lab, they take a assessment individually. And then in lab, one of the things that they do is they redo that assessment together and learn and submit their responses. So it effectively is a mini two-stage exam, but very, very low stakes. I think it's only worth 1 or 2% of their grade. And it really helped, like from the beginning, from week 1, they're working in groups, they're troubleshooting, they're building that trust. And I think the IAs as well, I've been really lucky to have wonderful instructional assistants who are really bought into helping establish classroom community. They've really promoted that. And so I think actually a good thing for us with students being in breakout rooms was that was their group, and they had that group identity that they carried through the quarter. In person, I found that keeping groups of the students who are in their own bays has been really helpful because that's who they're chatting with and checking in with during the quarter. And so I do think that a lot of it is that trust that gets built.
So along those lines, thinking about that trust, one of the questions, I shared a question with Lisa Chattel, and that her question was, how do the highest academically scoring students feel about this process?
Yeah, that's a
great, to be very competitive,
yeah.
and so
yeah, that's a great question, and I didn't go into detail here, but in the paper we explored how we did some tests to see if students who benefited more were more likely to perceive the exams positively than students who maybe if they didn't receive any benefits, were they less likely to perceive them positively. And we did not find differences there. And I should say we only looked at 2 quarters and most students perceived them positively. So we had a pretty low sample of students who didn't. But even when students didn't benefit on all of the exams, so those really high achieving students, they still reported feeling positively about it, being able to talk through answers, build that group cohesion. And so I think that was, and for those students, I imagine that part of that might be that group identity, that trust. Like even we had a couple of students who didn't need to take the 3rd exam because they were already set. I dropped the lowest exam, but they still showed up and took it because they wanted to participate in the group and really just like engage in that discussion, check in with their learning, and work together. And so I think that it really helped avoid competition in that way. And then I think I answered that. Sorry, I'm looking at the Q&A as well. Sorry.
But so another question was, how do you explain the explanatory factor analysis? That is, how and why did you, for example, modify the question, students in my group unfairly benefited?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we reverse coded that item. And so what that means is, since we had asked students on a scale of like strong 1 to 4, how they felt about this item, in order to align it with the other items that were positively scored, we did something called reverse coding, where we're still preserving the student feelings on the Likert scale, but we're just converting it to a way where we can take that average. And so the negative item did not decrease scores. I hope that, I don't want to get too into the weeds of the details, but I hope that addresses that question.
I think that makes sense. So another part of thinking about this is you showed this concept to be very effective. Why did you use 75-25% split instead of making it something like 50-50?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I followed recommendations from what other folks have done in the literature. I specifically was going off of what I think Carl Lyman's group has done. And I believe that their motivation is that the individual exam is still something that students are being assessed individually. And with the group being a portion of their final grade, but not being the dominant part, I think that might get away from that urge to have one, like to go to whoever the students think is the most prepared student and just rely on their responses, but really engage in that consensus building. To be fair, I haven't tried that. I would be interested to see if the group exam is worth more. Does that change the approaches that students are taking? That's a good question, but that was my motivation.
I don't know if anyone who's tried that, but in particular, if you had a topic that was really very strongly team focused, maybe that kind of shift would make good sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that would reflect really that motivation to incentivize group work and have that being included. I saw there was a question that I think disappeared. I don't know if it was already answered, but there was a question about accommodations, and I just wanted to really quickly address that. I checked in with our OSD at UCSD, and the approach that I took was students got extended time on the individual exam, but the group exam did not need extended time. And so students would come in early for the individual portion.
Great. So what about thinking about the logistics of an in-person exam versus
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts about this. I think online was actually easier in some ways because students could just share their screen and everyone had could see the questions from the same distance, and groups, you're kind of the same distance away from each other. And so when we're thinking about how to promote consensus building in that way, I liked that there was that equidistance between group members. In person, it's a little tricky because we take our exams in lab, and so they're taking them at the benches, which is not conducive to active learning. And so students they often, since they're in the same bay, they can pull out these little desks and sit and work together, but there's no easy way for them to all be looking at the same page at once. And we don't have any giant screens where we can be projecting things. And so I think if we were in an active learning classroom, this would be so much easier because just we could project questions and students could be discussing. We still made it work. I would give students, I started off giving students just one copy of the exam because that is recommended to build consensus and make sure that all students are discussing things. During spring quarter, though, I started giving 2 copies because we were worried about proximity with COVID, students being too close together, huddled over the exam. And so we encouraged students to still be working together in groups, but we gave a couple of copies so that they could see the questions that they were discussing, and they submitted 1 copy of the exam.
So another person asked the question, how would this approach help in building individual competencies? But let me just expand on that question and say, one of the competencies that you wanted to build was this ability to work as a team effectively.
Absolutely.
And is there any way of assessing whether that improved over the course of the
that's a great question. I will say we asked students Likert type questions about their perceptions of group work and whether and so their perceptions definitely increased. And I haven't done a more evaluative study on the effectiveness of their own group work. I'm inclined to say that based on these results, I think students did improve in their abilities to build, to take consensus building approaches, working in teams, think critically about whether all voices were being heard. Even in the one group that was not doing that, I think the open-ended responses shared that it showcased that that was something that they would have wanted. And I think that is, well, I wish that every group had experienced the discussion building. I think that group, those members may take that away with them, that's something they want to prioritize in future group interactions. And anecdotally, I'm in letter writing season, letter of recommendation writing. And I think I've been having a lot of meetings with students about how team building, collaboration, communication, and hearing other voices is something that they really gained from these experiences.
So Shara's asked another question about whether you gave a standard exam to try to figure out if this approach that you use improves students' individual learning. Part of that has to do with retention, which is something that you addressed in your paper.
Yeah, that's a great question. I did not, and I would have loved to use a concept inventory to identify if that really did improve students' individual learning. With online exams in winter, I tend to make all of my exams open note, and then I give students their keys back or their graded exams back so that they can learn from them after. And so I typically write new exams that try to be fairly isomorphic, but it wasn't a rigorous approach in using a standard exam. And a lot of that is, I guess, my trade-off of I still was viewing the exam, reviewing exams as part of the learning experience for students. But that would be great to do.
And then a question that's on everyone's mind is ChatGPT. And the question is, with ChatGPT, what do you think that means relative to this approach?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I make my exams open note, but they're open paper note. And so students aren't using electronic devices. And with being in person, we're all in person anyway. And so I view two-stage exams as wonderful for getting students to be able to think more critically. Like in all honesty, I ask more challenging open-ended questions so that students really do have to think about application, those higher level Bloom's levels where they're evaluating, they're creating. And I think that as educators, maybe with the rise of ChatGPT and other types of assessments, we should be thinking about more of that developing of that critical thinking, which is also, I saw one of the questions before was about competency. So developing critical thinking skills is absolutely something that we want students to do. And I think that being able to make arguments is a good skill. I could talk a lot about ChatGPT. I actually used it in my class in winter because students had to write a final lab report. And I demonstrated how ChatGPT addressed our research questions. And we used an in-class lesson to explore how good ChatGPT was at mimicking scientific writing. So what could we learn ourselves as writers for how to structure arguments? But then we critiqued it for using papers incorrectly or using incorrect or made up citations and references and thinking about the trustworthiness of writing. That's a whole separate thing that was not included in this study, but I do think that two-stage exams are a good approach for developing those collaborative skills and critical thinking as well.
Claire, we got very short amount of time, and
Yes,
a really interesting question just popped up. And that question basically is, how do you know that this really addresses student knowledge?
Yeah.
And a second really key part of this is it possible that the collaborative exams are masking the peer equity gap instead of increasing student learning?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing that I did not do that I would have loved to have done was identify the demographics of individual groups, because the way that I got data was I had individual student grades from throughout the quarter, and I submitted that to a third party at UCSD, and they matched students with based on their identifiers with their demographics, then removed everything. And what I got was just de-identified data. So I don't know who was in what group. I would have loved, because my suspicion based on the group exam, there were folks from all group demographic makeups, I believe, differed. And we had some groups that were, I think, all members of peers' identities, but I can't confirm that. And so I would love to do this study actually tracking that, because my suspicion is that it was that act of consensus building and really talking things out that really helped students. It's not that students were just benefiting from the other folks in their group, but really that active discussion was helpful. But I can't say that from the data that we have. And so that's a really good question. And then I think the first part was if it's actually addressing student knowledge or just collaborative learning. Actually, the other thing that I wanted to highlight was that by the third exam, we did not have significant equity gaps on the individual. And so to me, that does say that overall students were trending towards these decreases. And I know I'm at time for addressing student knowledge without a concept inventory. I guess I really can't say that for sure. And so there are limitations to the data that we have.
Thank you so much, Claire. Back to you, Rachel.
That was great. I'm learning so much. And you bring up some really good points. And it's going to be a great segue into a new webinar series that ASM is going to be hosting starting at the end of this month. And believe it or not, we're going to have a full session about artificial intelligence and how it can affect our assessments and building better assessments to look at critical thinking instead of just rote memorization. So take a look at that. We just launched the website this week and we're really excited for it. We've got some fabulous education thought leaders from across the country is going to be presenting webinars there. And don't forget that join us in person at ASMQ this year. It'll be middle of November in Phoenix, an in-person event. So submit your proposals by June 1st. And don't forget to register for the next JIMBY Live, which will be in 2 weeks from today, May 19th. And you can view today's episode again, if you want, on JIMBY's YouTube playlist. It'll be posted next week. And you can also view the full library. We have over 24 videos, all available for free from great educators. You can learn more. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you hopefully in 2 weeks. Thank you to our speaker moderator.
Thank you so much.